All right. Um, Diving into a pretty heavy topic today, but an important one. The United Nations and this whole idea of global peace. You've given us a lot to unpack here. Textbook excerpts, news articles. Some of them are about like successes and some are about failures. And then some really, I don't know, impactful images.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive look, I think, at the UN. We can look at the ideals, but then also, see how it's actually played out in reality, the track record.
Yeah, and I guess that's the mission here. How are they attempting to achieve these goals and is it actually working? And speaking of reality, I mean, looking at some of these images from World War II, they're pretty sobering.
It's easy to get, I think, numb to the statistics, like
Yeah.
59 to 84 million casualties, but you got to remember that each one of those numbers represents, a life lost,
Hmm.
families torn apart, and then of course the Holocaust,
Hmm.
the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews. It's really a stark reminder of what we're capable of.
Yeah. I mean, seeing the photos of the camps and like just piles of shoes left behind, it's a lot. It really drives home that human cost of war.
Yeah, and it was out of that devastation, really unimaginable devastation, that the UN was born. I mean, the world had just witnessed such horror, and they were desperate, right? Desperate for peace, for cooperation, for anything to prevent that from ever happening again.
Right. And so that's where the UN comes in. But we also have like the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I. So that was the first attempt, right, at a global peacekeeping organization. But obviously it didn't work. It failed to prevent World War II.
But
So did the UN, did they learn from those mistakes?
well, I think they certainly tried to. The UN was established in 1945, and it was very intentionally designed to be more robust than the League of Nations, more proactive. The League of Nations, you could argue, was more of a talking shop. I mean, think of it like this. The League of Nations was built on hope. The UN was built on hope, but also like on the hard lessons of the past.
So how did they structure the UN to actually keep the peace this time?
Well, at its core, the UN is an organization. It's made up of 193 member states, and each of those states has a voice in the General Assembly. But the real decision-making power, that lies with the Security Council.
Ah, yes, the Security Council. It's like the boardroom where all the big decisions happen.
Right.
And that's where we see the P5, those permanent members, France, UK, USA, Russia, and China. So why do they hold so much power?
Well, these were the victors of World War II. And each of those 5 countries, they hold veto power. And what that means is they can block any resolution, no matter how much support it might have from the other member states. So, you can see how the structure reflects that global power dynamic of the post-war era.
But does that structure, I mean, does it still hold up today? The world has changed so much since 1945. Like if you compare the global influence, say, of the USA versus like Luxembourg, I mean, they both get a seat at the table, but their impact is vastly different.
It's a good point. And this whole issue of the power dynamic within the UN, it's a source of constant debate. Critics will argue that this veto power, it gives the P5 undue influence. Supporters, on the other hand, they say that it's crucial for stability to prevent, rash decisions on a global scale.
So how does the UN, like, how does it go about actually influencing global behavior? What tools do they have?
Well, they use a range of methods. One is something called moral sanctions. And essentially what that means is publicly criticizing aggressor states. It's using shame on a global scale as a tool to encourage compliance.
So like a global timeout for bad behavior.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. And then you have economic sanctions.
Yeah.
These would be things like embargoes, trade restrictions, things that are designed to really isolate and pressure those aggressor states, basically like cutting them off from the global marketplace.
And then you have the most serious measure, which is military intervention. And the UN, I mean, they have a history of peacekeeping, peacemaking in conflict zones all over the world.
Right. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two things, right? Peacekeeping, that typically involves deploying, lightly armed forces. And their role is to monitor ceasefires, to separate those warring factions after they've agreed to stop fighting. Think of them more like referees. Peacemaking, on the other hand, that involves a more robust military intervention. And oftentimes, it's without the consent of all the parties involved, but the goal is to actively stop the conflict.
So peacekeepers are more like the referees and peacemakers are more like peace enforcers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And actually, the first ever UN peacekeeping force, that was deployed. That was way back in 1956, following the Suez Crisis. And their task was to separate the warring sides. And it was significant. I mean, it really showed that the UN could act as a neutral force in promoting peace.
I mean, that sounds promising, but we also have this whole stack of articles about the UN's failures. It can't all be success stories, right? What would you say are some of the UN's most notable achievements?
Yeah, you're right. The UN's history, it's far from perfect.
Yeah.
But I think it's important, before we get to the shortcomings, to acknowledge the things they have done well. And one of their most significant achievements, I would say, is in the realm of human rights.
Okay.
Universal Declaration of Human
Mm.
Rights. This was adopted in 1948,
Yeah.
and it was a landmark achievement.
Yeah. Big moment.
It was. It established a global standard, a common language, you could say, for human rights
Mm.
for all nations to aspire to.
That's powerful,
Right.
but it's not legally binding, right? So how effective can it really be?
Yeah, and that's a common critique. It's a fair point. But I think, you got to think of it kind of like a seed that was planted.
Yep.
It's influenced countless laws, treaties, movements. It's become like this touchstone for, activists and governments alike.
Mm.
And it's, led to the creation of other really crucial human rights documents and institutions.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, what about other, I don't know, tangible examples of their success?
Well, look at the World Health Organization, the WHO,
Right.
also established in 1948.
Okay.
They've been on the front lines of fighting diseases, pandemics, everything from tackling HIV in the 1980s to, navigating the recent COVID-19 pandemic.
Hmm.
I mean, their work has saved millions of lives.
It's hard to argue with that, but I mean, we do have this stack of articles here about the UN's failures as well. And there are some, I mean, truly devastating events highlighted here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the UN, they haven't always lived up to those founding ideals.
Hmm.
And one of the biggest criticisms I think that's leveled against the organization is its inability to effectively prevent or stop genocide.
Yeah, and I mean, the Rwandan genocide in 1994, that's the one that immediately comes to mind for me.
Mhm.
Those images are they're hard to even look at. It's hard to fathom, 800,000 people murdered in just 100 days.
Yeah, it was a horrific event. And it really was a catastrophic failure of the international community. And the UN has openly acknowledged that they were there. There were peacekeeping forces present in Rwanda at the time, but they were vastly under-resourced, and they didn't have the mandate to actually intervene effectively.
So, what went wrong there? Why weren't they better equipped to, handle something of that magnitude?
Well, there were a number of factors at play. I mean, there was a lack of understanding, frankly, about the true scale of the violence as it was unfolding, the speed with which it was happening. And there was a reluctance from some member states to get involved in what they perceived as an internal conflict.
Yeah.
And tragically, I think there was a failure to act on early warnings and pleas for help from people on the ground.
It's just heartbreaking to think about how many lives could have been saved if they had acted differently, if they had done something more.
It is, and it's a reminder of the stakes and the very real limitations that the UN faces. The Rwandan genocide, it really forced the UN to confront its shortcomings, though.
Mm.
It did lead to some internal reforms. They were aimed at improving their rapid response capabilities, but
So they learned from it, at least in some ways.
to a degree, yes.
Yeah.
But the UN is constantly, I think, grappling with this question of how to balance the sovereignty of individual nations with its responsibility to protect populations from atrocities.
I imagine that's a tough line to walk,
Yeah.
especially when you have powerful countries. Maybe they don't want to get involved, or maybe they're even, enabling those atrocities.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And it speaks, I think, to a broader issue, which is the UN's struggle to really effectively enforce human rights, even when it comes to its own members. We've seen instances where member states, even some of those P5 countries, have been accused of human rights violations. And the UN often struggles to hold them accountable.
So it's one thing to set a standard, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's another thing entirely to enforce it.
It is. And I think it underscores this inherent tension that exists within the UN.
Mhm.
It's an organization that's built on this ideal of international cooperation, but it's often hamstrung by the self-interests of individual member states.
And with all the complexities of global politics, I mean, it's got to be incredibly difficult to navigate those competing interests, those power dynamics.
It is, and that leads to, a lot of questions about the UN's effectiveness, its bureaucracy, and whether the structure itself, particularly that P5 veto power, is really still appropriate in the 21st century.
It feels like a constant uphill battle. So where does that leave the UN? I mean, is it this inherently flawed but necessary organization?
I mean, it's definitely complex. There's no doubt about that. The UN is grappling with these huge, global challenges. It's not perfect. And I mean, we've seen that its history is, marked by some remarkable successes, but also, as we've talked about, some really profound failures.
Yeah, but it's still here. It's still operational after all these years. So what do you think keeps it going?
I think at its heart, the UN, it represents an ideal, right? This idea that global cooperation, even if it's messy, even if it's imperfect, is still preferable to nations just operating in isolation, constantly, resorting to conflict to resolve their disputes.
Yeah, and you touched on this earlier, but it seems like its effectiveness really depends on its members,
Right.
especially the most powerful ones. It depends on their willingness to actually work together to find some kind of common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UN, it can only be as strong and as effective as its member states want it to be.
Hmm.
And we face these new, increasingly complex global threats like climate change, terrorism. I mean, who knows what the next pandemic will be, but facing threats like that, it seems like the need for international cooperation for a forum like the UN, it's only going to become more urgent, right?
It does feel like we're at this, I don't know, this pivotal point in history. Do you think that the UN, as it currently exists, is equipped to handle these 21st century challenges?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, you have people calling for like radical reforms,
Yeah.
everything from restructuring the Security Council to, just finding more effective ways to enforce its decisions. And a lot of debate centers around, that veto power that's held by the P5.
Hmm.
Some argue that it undermines the UN's legitimacy, that it creates this system where some countries are more equal than others.
Right. It makes you wonder, would those countries, the ones with the most power, would they ever give up any of that power for a more, equitable system?
It's a great question, and it really gets at like this core tension at the heart of international relations. But then you have others who argue that the UN's core principles, things like multilateralism, diplomacy, international cooperation, they say those are more important now than ever. And they think that strengthening the existing, mechanisms, improving efficiency, fostering greater trust between nations, that's the way forward.
So no easy answers then, no clear consensus on the best way to move forward.
Not at all. I think the future of the UN, it's really going to depend on a lot of things. The political will of its member states, what new global threats emerge, and the UN's own ability to adapt and evolve to really meet those challenges head on.
It really does feel like a lot is riding on its ability to change at the times.
Well, this has been this deep dive. It's given me a lot to think about. We've, explored the history of the UN, its triumphs, its failures, the huge challenges that it faces today. And it's clear that it's not perfect. It's this organization that's grappling with these incredibly complex issues, but it also seems pretty essential.
It is. And I think the important thing is that we as, global citizens, that we engage in these conversations, that we try to understand the role of the UN, its potential, but also its limitations, and that we advocate for the changes that we want to see in the world.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. So to our listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive on the UN, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning. How do you see the UN evolving? What role should it play in this, increasingly interconnected world? What kind of world do you want to see? And how can we all work together, within and beyond the UN to achieve it? Thanks for joining us for this exploration of the United Nations and its pursuit of global peace.